So when thinking about the concept of activism in the home, I began reflecting on what this means in relation to the life stories I collected from British-Pakistani women, and specifically how we define an activist. So my project about the migration, settlement and work experiences of women who came from Azad Kashmir and settled in Oldham and Middlesbrough between 1962 and 2002 has allowed for an historically ignored group to share their life stories. Women have described the choices they made in order to survive a vastly new and different place, working towards securing a more comfortable settlement for themselves, their family, and crucially, other women within their community. These were not big and highly visible forms of action, yet women were actively pushing familial, community, and societal boundaries regarding their roles and responsibilities, exhibiting significant agency over how their lives were to unfold post-migration. Women were actively challenging expectations within their home. And whilst there could be dispute about whether this is deemed a form of activism, specifically because no woman I've spoken to has described themselves in this way, the pursuit of economic independence and self-sufficiency in the face of bleak working class conditions, as well as the active pursuit of helping others within their network, were not passive processes. Women were drivers of change in their small bubbles, and even under the most difficult of circumstances, they made decisions to create change, even if that change was incremental. For me, this is arguably small-scale, everyday activism in action. One of the themes in particular that I believe highlights the importance of small-scale activism within the home is women's engagement with adult education. Upon interviewing women living in Middlesbrough, it became apparent that every woman I'd spoken to at one point or another had partaken in free educational classes and courses. Although individual narratives of migration and settlement are distinctive, education and training featured in every single story. This was consistent amongst women who had migrated across the period in question, between 1962 and 2002. The women I spoke to migrated to Middlesbrough knowing very little to no English and were compelled to give up education, often by male family members, by the time they were 15 years old. I argue that the desire to be independent and self-sufficient underpinned this mass pursuit of education, to partake in wide-ranging activities, particularly so they were not burdensome upon family members who were working long hours in factories and foundries. So one of the earliest directives in relation to English education was the Local Government Act of 1966, which invested funds in areas where there were significant migrant populations, quote, ethnic minorities whose language and customs differ from those of the rest of the community. This was an exercise of exerting control, implying that those who brought with them foreign languages and traditions needed to be remoulded to appease communities unwilling to accept non-white migrants, while simultaneously continuing the recruitment of exploitable immigrants for economic purposes. However, the pursuit of learning amongst some British Pakistani women preceded the enactment of policy. During the initial wave of women's migration, English education began in homes and community centres before local authorities and the government began focusing resources towards formal migrant education. Women were aware that learning education was crucial to a more comfortable settlement, since they could not rely upon their husbands who were working long hours. It was a stepping stone towards new forms of independence that began with creating community networks in order to facilitate informal learning. Jamila could attest to this. She arrived in the UK in 1957, making her one of the first Pakistani women to settle in Middlesbrough. When I asked about the ways in which migrant Pakistanis socialised with one another, she mentioned the local community centre, the International Centre, which became the hub for training and basic English classes. She said, quote, the centre opened and got women together. Before that, women didn't leave their home. They, social services, thought that if women stayed inside too long, they would get depression, always sitting inside and thinking. The International Centre that helped people with these problems, women got together. So although she was not fluent in English, Jamila took on the role of translator when women needed to converse with non-Pakistani professionals. Learning through community networks became a way in which women could shift their focus away from their solitary existence of settling in a new, highly unfamiliar place. So multiple expectations shape women's everyday state, irrespective of who they are or where they come from. As Mary Hughes and Mary Kennedy thoughtfully suggest, we must consequently, quote, break the silence of women in education by illuminating how the education system has been used by women in a variety of ways. By doing so, I hope to highlight that women from all backgrounds breaking the tradition of dependence upon male household and community members, were actively choosing post-compulsory education. And this is a complicated and non-linear process. It is a choice that has specific ramifications on household relations by broadening the skills and capabilities of women and potentially reconfiguring the divisions of labour. Learning English had profound consequences on the conduct of migrant women. They no longer had to rely on men in order to fulfil their everyday activities. Certainly that was the case for Jamila, helping women in her community. For Rabia, however, it was a type of freedom that her husband opposed. Aged 89, she's lived the majority of her life in Middlesbrough, migrating and reuniting with her son in 1968 and bringing with her 4 young children. She was the daughter of an imam, and she had been given an extensive religious education, a privilege seldom afforded to women at the time given the patriarchal nature of religious education. She eventually became an Islamic teacher, a job that would garner her immense respect from the community. An early conversation brought to my attention the fundamental importance this community of British Pakistani women placed on learning. It shall not have come as a surprise, since Rabia was an example of how women spearheaded Islamic education amongst off-ignored girls who were not permitted to learn with the male congregation. Learning and education had defined her working life. However, learning English was a far more difficult feat. She said, quote, "My husband never let me go to English classes. They, the women from social services, said these women need to learn English, teach them to read books, to have conversations. But my husband, he didn't want me to learn. I used to say, if you come here, you should know some English, but I thought I would go back to Pakistan." She revealed that other Pakistani women would come to her house with books and encourage her to learn English. However, her husband disallowed this. Rabia had instead learned some English by picking up words from her children and grandchildren. The difficulty of getting her husband to agree, he thought that if she learned English, she would leave. To get him to agree to her education was the primary reason that she gave up pursuing community learning. But this does not take away from the fact that Rabia was driven by an enthusiasm to learn. She saw great value in English proficiency, negotiating her difficult circumstances in order to fulfill her aspiration in part. It's only when women are spoken to rather than spoken about that these complex mediations are illustrated. In later decades, it was skills training rather than English acquisition that had the most marked impact on women's lives. Adult education in this region has a long history stretching back to the WEA into post-war industrial development, but now has been specifically aimed at addressing the consequences of deindustrialization and joblessness. This particularly affected and benefited the women I spoke to, not their husbands or sons, who responded to the closure of factories by becoming self-employed instead and being small business owners. Women were able to take advantage of a vast array of new vocational training programs, such as apprenticeships and courses geared towards businesses, teaching, catering, beauty, and so on. This represents a marked difference between the educational resources afforded to women who migrated in the 60s compared to those who migrated in the 80s and 90s. Crucially, however, even women who were unable to take advantage of formal learning programs were keen to pursue informal learning opportunities, which they saw as essential in order to contribute to their household and community. This was especially important for those women who found traditional learning institutions inaccessible or exclusionary. Nadia, who wanted to learn in order to ensure her family had a high disposable income, faced multiple challenges, as lower English proficiency and academic attainment stopped her from accessing formal work. But she was also responsible for looking after her disabled daughter. Vocational training simply did not fit into a chaotic life. Instead, she compromised by seeking informal community-based learning in order to develop her interest in cooking into a wage-earning job. Nadia did not know what life in the UK would look like, but work outside the home was beyond what she had imagined for herself. She said, "I was never well educated, so I didn't ever think about work. Maybe if I was born here, I could think, I want to be this, like you can. In Pakistan, they didn't let women go to school. Finishing primary school was okay for me there, but they wouldn't let women learn. They'd say, what will women do with an education? All they'll do is get married. But I've been the samosa maker for a while now. I do it for the money, and it also helps me pass the time. It helps me buy things for my kids. I learned how to cook for my mom, and the samosas, my friend taught me to make them properly. Even when I make them now, I think, thank God she taught me." The process of absorbing what was occurring around her shaped Nadia's work aspirations. To see someone of a similar class and background making money by selling food clearly influenced how she saw her daily activity changing once her children had gone to school. Aspirations are under a constant state of change and mediating and refashioning in relation to new experiences and environments. In this sense, formal and informal skills and vocational training brought to life a new way of understanding what women's everyday state could be. When I asked if she wanted to build her small business, she revealed a poignant reality of her life. Work had to remain informal because her disabled daughter was a priority. She said, "I can't work more than I do because my daughter needs 24-hour care and I have housework on top of that as well." What I hope this short presentation has demonstrated is that education and training played a crucial role in the settlement of British Pakistani women, preparing them to be more self-sufficient and less dependent upon their husbands. Not only does this highlight a sense of ambition that counteracts the stereotype of apathy and submissiveness attached to them, I've also illustrated how some women use this as a stepping stone towards wage-earning labour. Women capitalised on the availability of learning and training opportunities with the hope that this could eventually lead to formal work. The will to learn was powerful, but formal work was difficult to fit into the matrix of responsibilities that constituted women's everyday state. Crucially, by bringing this fundamental aspect of women's settlement to light, activism, in the broadest sense of the term, is being exhibited. Women were willing to help each other in the pursuit of a more comfortable long-term settlement. It was not uncommon to hear examples of women pursuing education and training to help lift their families out of poverty and to ease the pressures of working class life. In turn, the perceived expectations of housebound existences that statistics and current historical narratives perpetuate are in part challenged. Thank you.